In my program yesterday, I discussed at length Stian Jensen, that's to say Jens Stoltenberg's chief of staff's comments about Ukraine making territorial concessions to Russia in return for peace and eventual joining of NATO and integration into the Euro-Atlantic system. Well, after those comments by Jensen, there were furious, angry responses from Ukraine, as was entirely predictable, and as was also entirely predictable, the denials, or seeming denials, came. So firstly, we have the White House saying that they're not aware of any negotiations of the kind that Jensen is talking about, which is incidentally true, because there are actually no formal negotiations of any kind taking place at the moment, nor is it clear that this plan, the plan that Jensen was talking about, has been formally proposed to the Russian government, or that the Russians have responded about it, or that the United States government, the Biden administration, in other words, has committed itself to it. But of course, that is the beauty of the discussions that are ongoing in Moscow, or which have attempted to get ongoing in Moscow. The people who are conducting them on the American side are not officials of the administration. They're not officials of the US government. They are ex-officials, people connected to the Council for Foreign Relations, so that the United States government, the Biden White House, can deny that anything at all is happening, even, of course, as it actually happens. That is the beauty of relying on informal intermediaries. And then, of course, Jens Stoltenberg came out and he's made further statements saying that the West, NATO, will continue to support Ukraine until it wins, even though he also said that there's an awful lot of hard fighting to go and things aren't going quite as well as perhaps had originally been expected. But of course, the point here again is that the Jensen comments only make sense if it's now acknowledged privately that Ukraine is not going to win, which of course makes Stoltenberg's comment completely meaningless. And then, of course, there's been an apology and apparent denial from Jensen himself. But actually, if you read his words carefully, and of course reading words carefully is something that people rarely do, but if you read his words carefully, you see that he's not actually repudiating his proposal, if that is what one can call it, suggestion perhaps he would prefer to say. He's not actually repudiating it. He says that it was a mistake to discuss it in the way that he did on that particular talk show program. This is again the beauty of kite flying, which is of course what Jensen was up to on behalf of his various masters, Stoltenberg, the US administration, and the rest. You can pretend that you're just thinking aloud, even though, of course, officials like him should not be thinking aloud. And, of course, having the chief of staff of the NATO Secretary General float these ideas makes it very easy for the NATO Secretary General himself, Jens Stoltenberg, to pretend that he has nothing to do with them, even though, as I've already said, there is no realistic possibility that Jensen would have said the things that he did say if he had not been prompted to do that by officials, including Stoltenberg, more senior to himself. And I would say that there's already been commentaries to that effect in the Norwegian media, so I understand they are also making the point that Jensen would not have spoken out in the way that he did if he had, in fact, not been cleared to do that by Stoltenberg and by other senior officials in NATO and in the top NATO governments, including, of course, the United States. Now, as a matter of fact, we can say definitely that these pretended denials should not be taken entirely seriously, because there have been other comments appearing in other places, the Financial Times, as we'll see, in Newsweek, which also hint very much at the same thing. Now, perhaps the most interesting is an article which has appeared today in the Financial Times, and it is by Domitila Zagramozo, and it's a lengthy article, published a couple of hours before the making of this program. She is a senior lecturer in conflict and security at King's College London, and it's likely that this article has been penned hastily following the Jensen comments, but I get the sense that when it was written, that it was being prepared in some form, or that Zagramozo, Domitila Zagramozo, already was thinking some of the things that Jensen has been saying, and has been given cause to think that. And you could see this. You could see how this becomes clear when you read through the article itself. And you see, for example, you get a sense of what's happening from paragraphs like this. The Kremlin is increasingly coming to terms with the fact that Ukraine will neither be denazified, there will be no pro-Russian puppet government in Kiev, nor demilitarized, nor will it remain neutral. This is now clear to Moscow, and that Ukraine will probably become part of the EU and anchored to Euro-Atlantic security structures. For Russia, accepting these new realities is a significant concession. Moscow's priorities appear to be safeguarding itself against Ukrainian and NATO forces, retaining some of the land it currently occupies in Ukraine, especially Crimea and possibly in the Donbass, and ensuring Putin saves face after a compromise is found. Now that essentially is the proposal that Jensen was talking about, giving Russia, Crimea, Donbass, other territories in return for Ukraine's membership, ultimate membership of NATO and of the Euro-Atlantic security structures. Notice the way in which this article is worded, because Zagramozo tells us that the Kremlin, that's to say Putin, is increasingly coming to terms with the facts that Ukraine will neither be denazified nor demilitarized, nor will it remain neutral. Moscow accepts that probably Ukraine will become part of the EU and anchored to Euro-Atlantic security structures. For Russia, accepting these new realities is a significant concession. Where is the evidence that the Russians have come to terms with any of this? Zagramozo uses the expression come to terms, but where? What statement has been made by any Russian official that suggests that any of this is true? Yesterday, I said that, taking my cue from Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism, Western governments and officials within Western governments, when they come up with proposals like the one that Jensen is floating, spend an inordinate amount of time negotiating these proposals with each other and assume the agreement of the other side once the proposals have been hammered out in that sort of way. Except, and we see a classic example of this in this paragraph. The Russians have not come to terms with any of the things that Zagramurzo is talking about, or at least there is no indication that they have done so. On the contrary, they have got out of their way to say, and have repeatedly said, that the conditions set out by President Putin at the start of the special military operation in February must be fulfilled, and these include denazification, however that is to be construed, demilitarization, and Ukraine remaining neutral. These are non-negotiable terms as far as the Russians are concerned. There's been statement after statement from Russian officials that reiterate this. Indeed, the Russian ambassador to Washington, Mr. Antonov, continues to make that very same point. And yet, we see in this article in the Financial Times that supposedly Moscow, Russia, has decided to give that all up, though of course not a single reference is given to a single statement by a Russian official that would imply that, because of course no such statement exists. The assumption is that the Russians would agree to this, but there is no actual evidence that that is the case. And then she goes on to say that, in fact, Zagramurzo goes on to say that even this outcome, however, might be a difficult, a very hard sell. Obviously, there's some people who would be in the West very unhappy even with this outcome. She says, accepting Russia's conditions, that it keeps part, if not all, of the seized territories in exchange for an end to the war and its tacit acceptance of Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic alignment. In other words, the Yeltsin proposal is highly risky. Not only would this undermine Kiev, it would justify Russia's aggression and might even encourage new assaults, for instance, by China in the Indo-Pacific. There is no guarantee that Russia will not regroup its forces after a ceasefire agreement is reached, putting Ukraine under renewed threat. So Zagramurzo is clearly less than enchanted by the Yeltsin proposal, but she assumes, without any basis, that the Russians are interested in it, notwithstanding that the Russians have made it quite clear, and repeatedly clear, that they are not. Now, Zagramurzo's article is also interesting because, of course, she speaks also of the fact that there are negotiations actually underway, or at least talks underway, between the Russians and the Americans. And this is, of course, implicit, but this is what she says. The bigger question is whether Russia will make concessions. Despite official silence from the Kremlin, the US appears to be in informal discussions with Moscow. And that's clearly a reference to the informal discussions by the Council for Foreign Relations, the ex-US diplomats, which I've discussed at great length in previous programs, which were touched on by Moscow Times, and that's clearly what she is referring to there. And she says that there appears to be that the United States appears to be in informal discussions with Moscow, but of course she clearly or at least this is how I read it, knows that those discussions are taking place. Then she goes on to say this: whilst it is possible that the Russian president may contemplate compromises, his plans to double defense expenditure in 2023 and to increase the maximum conscription age suggest otherwise. So what we see is that even as she considers that the Russians might be prepared to concede Ukraine's eventual NATO membership, because that's what the Jensen proposal amounts to, or at least the anchoring of Ukraine in the Euro-Atlantic structures, she accepts that there is actually no indication from the Russian government that it is prepared to do that. And in fact, Putin's actions, his decisions to double defense spending, by the way, that is far from being entirely confirmed, but let's let that pass, and increase the maximum conscription age, suggest on the contrary that Putin remains resolute in pursuit of his objectives. All of this brings to mind again that Moscow Times article, the proposals being made to the Russians. These are essentially the proposals, as I've discussed, that we've seen in the Jensen plan. The idea is territorial concessions by Ukraine in return for a ceasefire, allowing eventually the integration of Ukraine into the Euro-Atlantic structures, or at least of what Ukraine is left. Anyway, that's the proposal that is being floated, or which is being made. But of course, the Moscow Times article told us that the talks are at an impasse, that the Russians are unresponsive. It blamed all of this on Putin, very much as Zagramoso appears to be blaming him as well. And again, the implication is that if Putin is the obstacle, then on the basis that this is a deal that the Russians ought to be interested in, the best way out for them is to remove Putin from the scene. It is all very strange, but that does seem to be the thinking that people have in the West. They've come up with this proposal, a proposal which doesn't meet Russia's core concerns, and they still imagine that the Russians might be brought round to accept it, and perhaps the big obstacle, the roadblock to getting the Russians to accept it is Putin himself. But then, of course, let's try to find a way to try to get the problem of Putin sorted out. Now, there's a very interesting fact about this Financial Times article, the article by Zagramoso, because, of course, when he talks about the obstacles to the plan, the fact that somebody is opposing them, it refers to Putin. When it talks about the Russians having come to an acceptance of the realities, the supposed realities of Ukraine's eventual integration into the Euro-Atlantic structures, we no longer see the name Putin used. It becomes the Kremlin instead. So again, the implication is that shadowy figures in the Kremlin have supposedly come to all of these realizations. They can be satisfied with a land grab in eastern Ukraine, and that's a nice reward for them. It enables them to save face. It gets them out of what Zagramozo and people in the West imagine is a difficult situation. And all that they need to do is to push Putin aside. Anyway, it's a fascinating article, very interesting, very, very cleverly worded, but also, in my opinion, showing once more the lack of understanding of Russian policy that informs so much of Russian commentary in the West, the lack of understanding of Putin's position, of his authority within Russia, of the support that he possesses within not just the wider Russian electorate, but also within the Kremlin itself, where, to be straightforward about it, I have seen not a scintilla of evidence, not a trace of evidence that his line is being disputed by anyone. Anyway, that's the Zagramozo article. We've also had comments by no less a person than President Nicolas Sarkozy of France. Now, Sarkozy was president of France during the 2008 Georgia crisis. He attempted to mediate a compromise between the Russians and the Saakashvili government in Georgia at that time. Many people still believe that he did broker a compromise between the Russians and the Saakashvili government. They're not actually aware of the fact, or they choose to forget the fact, that what Sarkozy actually brokered, which was a deal whereby Georgia basically accepted that the future status of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the two breakaway regions from Georgia, would be up for future discussion. Anyway, in return for a ceasefire and a pullback of Russian forces from Georgia itself. Anyway, that deal actually broke down because Saakashvili, though he appeared to accept that in, I believe, the English language text, or one of the texts of the agreement, he then unilaterally changed the text to continue to insist that these two territories remained part of Georgia. The Russians obviously saw this as Saakashvili going back on what had been agreed, and so they went ahead and recognized unilaterally South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent countries. Nonetheless, it is fair to say that in 2008, Sarkozy did exhibit a level of realism in his dealings with the Russians that one rarely sees in the West nowadays. And apparently he continues to approach the issue of relations with Russia along the same sort of lines. And of course, he is a politician, and I'm confident that part of the reason that he is making these statements, the statements that I'm going to discuss in a short time, is because he is now seriously considering a presidential run. This is despite the fact that his previous term ended in controversies, previous criminal prosecutions, deep unpopularity, but he still, I think, imagines himself potentially a future president of France. And I think he is positioning himself as the realistic candidate who can reach some kind of a deal with the Russians, but who is at the same time an establishment figure and not, therefore, Marine Le Pen. Anyway, I'm not going to waste time with Sarkozy's ambitions, which I'm confident will not be realised. I'm going to talk again about what he says. He says, first of all, that Crimea was Russian until 1954. The people there consider themselves to be Russian. It is unrealistic to think that Crimea can ever be a part of Russia. and he seems to accept that that might also be true in some of the other regions that the Russians currently occupy, and he therefore suggests that there should be a territorial compromise on that basis, with the rest of Ukraine again pressing ahead to integrate itself with the Euro-Atlantic institutions. But in the meantime, there will be new referenda, internationally supervised, in Crimea and in Donbass and all of those other places, to confirm whether these regions do indeed want to continue to be under Russian control. Again, if you go back to the Moscow Times article, that is exactly what the ex-US diplomat, or rather the US ex-diplomat, who was participating in those discussions, said was the proposal that was being made to the Russians. Hold all these referendums again, but conduct them this time under some form of international supervision. And we see Sarkozy refloating that same idea all over again. In fact, I have no doubt at all that this has been widely discussed in Western chancelleries, behind the scenes, amongst Western governments. Sarkozy, who still has his connections, of course, in Paris, he's picked up on all of this, and he's now also running with it as the solution, at least the temporary solution. I would add, of course, that Ukraine itself will not recognise, at least the current government in Ukraine, will not recognise the outcome of any such referendums. But, of course, that brings us back to the Germany variant that people are talking about. Ukraine would not recognise the referendums. It would continue to insist that de jure, legally speaking, these territories remain part of Ukraine. So, no doubt, would most Western governments, so unquestionably would the United States, but the issue would be kicked into the long grass. Ukraine would be able to join NATO and integrate itself with NATO and with the European Union and achieve all of these things. And at the same time, one day they would wait for Putin, his government, what they call the regime in Moscow, to collapse, just as the Soviet Union once did. And then at that point, according to this theory, Ukraine would be able to march back in and reoccupy all of these territories and to reintegrate them back into Ukraine, just as West Germany was eventually able to do with East Germany. Again, to reiterate, the Russians in those talks in Moscow have turned all this down flat. The ex-diplomat who was briefing Moscow Times about these discussions actually said that the talks had hit an impasse and that they were not making any progress. And as I've discussed, that is why he actually gave that interview to Moscow Times in the first place, in an attempt to get the negotiations kick-started, and also in a further attempt to reach out to these mysterious people in the Kremlin and to try to get them to push Putin aside so that Putin, the obstacle to these talks, can be removed from the scene and the negotiations can take place and the agreement on these lines can be reached. And going back to the Zagramozo article in the Financial Times, she talks about the Jeddah talks and the future negotiations that are going on with the following the meeting in Jeddah, and one gets the sense that at some point the Zelensky peace plan having been rejected outright by the Global South in Jeddah, the idea will be to try to get everybody behind this new proposal that we see Jensen and Sarkozy and the Council for Foreign Relations and all of these people talk about, and that this will be the new plan that they will try to get floated. Well, there we are. So that's the article in the Financial Times, the commentaries by Sarkozy. But of course, we've had more. We've now had one of the most complicated and contradictory articles about this war that I have ever seen appear in Newsweek. And it's actually a very, very difficult article to make sense of. But briefly, its point is that the offensive is going far more slowly than anybody predicted. It says that Western governments are becoming frustrated and exasperated and are beginning to develop doubts about the prospects of this offensive. There are looming fears that Russia will go on the offensive itself in the spring, and that the groundwork for a huge Russian offensive in the spring is being prepared. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is actually, it's premature to say that the offensive has failed. Maybe the Ukrainians will be able to break through over the course of this offensive. After all, they making slow but steady, incremental progress. Sometime in the fall, in the autumn, they'll have perhaps severed the land bridge and threatened Crimea in some manner. And anyway, the article, having basically put its money on both sides of this argument, then says that there is an argument in Kiev itself, in Ukraine, about the way forward. And it says that Zelensky and his officials are beginning to worry about the support of the West because the offensive is not making the progress that they were expecting. There's acknowledgements that the offensive has been talked up too much, and that they also might be interested in considering peace negotiations. And of course, it doesn't specify what those negotiations would be. They're not discussed in detail, but it's fairly clear, if you read this very complex and in some ways very confusing article, that what is being talked about is, again, a variant of the Jensen plan. Territorial concessions to the Russians, an acknowledgement that certain territories cannot be restored to Ukraine, but freedom to Ukraine to pursue its Euro-Atlantic future, the remainder of Ukraine, for it to pursue its Euro-Atlantic future. So there's been some suggestions. This seems to be the line that is being taken. But allegedly, or purportedly, this is being opposed by hardliners, by military officials like General Zaluzhny, the chief of Ukraine's military. He, on the contrary, not only appears to be rejecting negotiations, but he supposedly wants to press ahead with the offensive. He's not given up on it yet. And bizarrely, the article sort of concedes that Zaluzhny, who is now supposed to be keen to press on with the offensive, despite the lack of progress. Anyway, Zaluzhny supposedly did express doubts about the offensive before it was launched. We have abundant evidence that that is the case. But now, apparently, he's the man who wants to see this offensive continued despite all the problems. And we have an absolutely bizarre quote from some unnamed Western official that Zaluzhny, if he'd been a NATO officer, would have refused outright to conduct a offensive of this sort without air support, without long-range missiles, without far more artillery and equipment, and that it's his fault somehow that the offensive was launched in that kind of way, and despite the fact that he argued against it. Now, all this is extremely complicated and very difficult to understand, and I do wonder whether it really does reflect actual arguments or discussions that are really taking place in Kiev. Zaluzhny, it is true, has in the past appeared to rule out any concessions at all to the Russians, and has appeared to shoot down the idea of concessions. But I also remember that in that article, that interview he gave to The Economist back in December of last year, he actually floated the possibility that he might at some stage find himself in the position of Marshal Mannerheim, the commander of the Finnish military during the Winter War with the Soviet Union of 1939 and 1940. Mannerheim led a courageous defense against the Soviets over the course of that war, but he came to understand in the end that Soviet military power, the Red Army, were too strong, and eventually it was he who took the key decision to seek peace. And he made a famous statement to the Finnish soldiers, which Zaluzhny referenced, in which he commended their heroism, said that it was impossible for them to prevail against a great power, and instead that there was no alternative but to seek a compromise. That was the position Zaluzhny was taking in December. Perhaps he's hardened his views since then, or perhaps he's discovered that it is impossible, given his position, for him to pursue such a position of compromise in the future. He's not in a position, in other words, to be Ukraine's Mannerheim or Robert E. Lee. And even though he's perhaps contemplated that possibility, he no longer really believes in it, or knows that he doesn't have the support in Ukraine to carry it off. Who knows? But the other interesting thing that this article says is that the military, the Ukrainian military, supposedly talked up the prospects of this offensive, that the failure of the offensive is their fault and Zaluzhny's fault. We come back to that statement that a NATO commander would never have launched an offensive in these conditions, and that Zaluzhny is somehow at fault for doing so. And it does seem as if somebody is setting Zaluzhny up for blame when it becomes clear that the offensive has failed. And by the way, this is not entirely wrong, because if you go back to that interview Zaluzhny gave to The Economist back in December, he was actually talking about a possible military campaign to isolate and eventually liberate Crimea. And he was saying what weapons he needed to succeed in that offensive. And he was talking about 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers. And he didn't mention F-16 fighter jets or air defense systems or any of those things, which he has been demanding for months now, and says which are essential if the offensive is to succeed. He didn't talk about any of that. Back in December, he demanded tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and artillery, And he got nearly all of what he was actually asking for in that article, in that interview he gave in December. Of course, Zelensky can argue that the situation between his interview in December and the actual launching of the offensive in June had changed, and that he can't be held to account because what he proposed in December had become unworkable in June. But again, it's perhaps not surprising if some people in the West looking for scapegoats, and some people in Ukraine perhaps also in search of scapegoats because the offensive has failed, that they turn on Zelensky and say, well, it's he who's to blame. He talked up the prospects of the offensive. Perhaps he tried to draw back later, but ultimately it was his idea and he's responsible that it's all gone wrong. And the Newsweek article then even floats the possibility of all sorts of military leaders being sacked, a major reshuffling of the military leadership of Ukraine, Zelensky being sacked, and by the way, alongside that, there are now rumours circulating again, and they're only rumours, that Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, who of course was also a supporter of the offensive and who also played a key role back in December and January and February in getting all those tanks, the Leopard 2s and Challengers and all of those supplied to Ukraine in order to fulfill the offensive. Anyway, there's rumours that he might be sacked as well and given an ambassadorship somewhere as compensation. Now, it's a very confusing article, and one doesn't quite understand what this whole thing is driving at. But it could be that what is behind it all is that there is indeed pressure on Zelensky and on the government to begin negotiations, and negotiations along the lines of the Jensen proposal, which is clearly the proposal which has been floated in these informal talks by the people from the Council for Foreign Relations, and that in order to spare Zelensky the embarrassment of going back on all the various things that he said in the past, you set up Zelensky in particular, and perhaps Reznikov as well, as the scapegoats for all that has gone wrong. So we can see, in summary, that all these denials of, the fact that anybody is really contemplating the Jensen plan. I call it the Jensen plan because, well, it might as well be given some label, and it's Jensen who has floated it most publicly, the one Western official up to this point who has floated it publicly. Anyway, we can see that despite the denials that this is a real plan, all of the other indications, articles in the Financial Times, articles in Newsweek, comments from President Sarkozy or former President Sarkozy of France, all of them point in the same direction, that there's some kind of a desire to get these negotiations going and to try to find some kind of a compromise with the Russians, a compromise on Western terms, in good time before the American elections next year, with quiet hints to Russian officials and oligarchs and people like that, that if Putin is the roadblock, then he should be disposed of so that the negotiations can take place. Now, yesterday I said that all of this is completely unreal, that it doesn't take in any way into account either the military or economic or political realities at the moment. And it is to those realities I'm going to turn, because the news from the battlefronts continues to be grim. Grim for Ukraine and grim for the prospects of this plan. Plan like this might have some prospect of gaining some traction amongst some people in Moscow, though it would, I suspect, continue to be opposed in Moscow by many, many more if Ukraine's offensive were making at least some progress. At the moment, it is not making any progress at all. Now, over the course of today, there's been more attacks by Ukraine towards the village of Rabotino, north of the Surovikin line. And again, all of the reports tell us the same thing. This time, once more, apparently mechanized units were used. There were tanks and armored vehicles and all those sort of things. But again, there was no breakthrough. Rabotino remains under Russian control. Ukrainians appear to have reoccupied some of the trenches which they'd occupied previously and which the Russians then recaptured. The Ukrainians have captured them again, but they have failed to capture Rabotino. And we're now getting reports that Ukraine is about to commit its last important reserve formation. This is the 82nd Airborne Brigade, which is the brigade equipped with the Challenger 2 tanks. We've been seeing pictures of them appearing on the Zaporozhye front lines. They haven't yet seen action, but they're now trundling around, some of them trundling around with sort of cages on top to protect them from these Russian suicide drones. And it's also supposedly the brigade which has been equipped with the Striker armoured personnel carriers, though some of these Strikers have apparently already been used on the battlefields. And this brigade is now going to be thrown into the battle. It's going to make the next attempt to break through, to capture Rabotino, and ultimately, I suppose, to penetrate the Surovikin line. And one of the fascinating things about that article in Newsweek is that it too concedes that in no place so far has Ukraine managed to reach the Surovikin line. In fact, most unusually, it actually refers to the Surovikin line by that very name. It actually calls it the Surovikin line, and it says that so far Ukraine has failed to reach it. And of course, even if Rabotino is indeed captured, which might be, this is not a possibility one should in any way discount, the Surovikin line lies beyond it. And the exact words were, after 6 weeks of fighting, I don't know how, by the way, Newsweek comes up with that calculation, because it's not 6 weeks of fighting that we've seen, it's more like 10 weeks of fighting. But anyway, after 6 weeks of fighting, Ukrainian forces are yet to reach the first line of the so-called Surovikin line, a network of defences built out since late 2022, initially under the direction of General Sergei Surovikin. So that's a straightforward admission that Ukraine has yet to battle through to the Surovikin line, though presumably someone in Newsweek thought that admitting that 10 weeks of fighting, having failed to achieve that, looked embarrassing, so they've dialed down the weeks to just 6. Anyway, capturing Rabotino is not going to solve the underlying problem. It's just another village. It speaks an awful lot about Ukraine's problems, that they've not even managed to capture this particular village. As I said, the Surovikin line lies beyond, and beyond that is Tokmak, with another layer of defences as well, and there are many more defences beyond Tokmak too. So, haven't been able to capture Rabotino. What real prospect is there of an advance beyond that? And one of the reasons to doubt that there's going to be any great breakthrough is that alongside the problems of the Surovikin line lying beyond Rabotino, there is the fact that, according to US reports, the 82nd Airborne Brigade, with its 14 Challenger 2 tanks, 14, not 40 or 400 or whatever one might consider is necessary for a breakthrough here, 14 tanks and perhaps 100, 150 Striker wheeled armoured personnel carriers, that it numbers around 2,000 men. And I have to say, that seems to me a completely inadequate number for a breakthrough of this kind. Anyway, this is what we're told. 82nd Brigade is going to be committed to this probably final major attack towards Rabotino. If it fails, Ukraine basically is out of reserves. And that is a very ominous development. On the Vremivka salient area, Staromayorsk and Rozhanye, I'm sorry, I'm always getting the name of this village wrong. Anyway, they apparently now are in the grey zone. Ukraine has been unable to consolidate control of these two places. And again, there are more villages and apparently a whole small town to capture before the Surovikin line is reached, even in this area. And in the other area, the other axis of advance, which is Bakhmut, the Bakhmut area, the Ukrainians, if anything, have been pushed back. So, news for Ukraine, very grim. But of course, it isn't just that Ukraine is failing to break through. We're now getting more reports about events further north around Kupiansk. And there's been a very interesting report by Redovka. Again, Russian website. You must always allow for the biases. But as I've said many times, Redovka does appear to have good reporters on the ground and accurate access to information from Russian frontline troops. And I've generally found its reports to be, well, not 100% reliably accurate, but generally accurate. And this is what Redovka is saying, has been saying just a few hours before this video appeared, about the situation near Kupiansk. It says that the Russian army is actively breaking up the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine and is rapidly moving towards Kupiansk. The Russian forces are sweeping away enemy strongholds and observation posts on their way. The offensive is expanding every day, and the situation is becoming more difficult for Ukraine's military. Under the constant hail of fire from the Russian artillery, Ukrainian troops are being forced to leave their positions, opening more space for more advances and movements by the Russian forces. It is reported from the field that the Ukrainian military has left part of its positions in Sinkovka. That is this village very close to Kupiansk, practically a suburb. And it goes on to say the Ukrainian military has retreated to an urgently formed fortified area, which is referred to as Netecha, which is to the northwest of Petropavlovka, a suburb of Kupiansk, even closer to Kupiansk itself, which is on the eastern suburbs, and there are already shooting battles in full swing. This is for Petropavlovsk. And it says that Petropavlovsk is one of the key settlements on the eastern flank and of Kupiansk, and its capture will allow the Russian army to reach the H-26 highway, thereby approaching Kupiansk for a further assault on the city. And then there is a map which provides, it's actually an unusually clear map, but it gives us a sense of the nature of the Russian advance. And the thing to say about it is that the Russians appear to be advancing on a broad front. They're not, as I said before, attacking in localized places, trying to punch through. They're apparently instead advancing on a broad front, stretching Ukrainian defenses and at the same time securing their own flanks. And on this map, one could see the village of Olshana, which the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed had been captured by the Russians about a week ago, and it is now clearly well within Russian territory. You also see another village called Liman Pervi, which has also been often discussed by the Russian Defense Ministry in its various commentaries, and we can see that that is now also securely under Russian control, and there are pictures which show the Russian forces literally adjacent to Sinkovka, which they appear to be in the process of storming, and that they're also pushing very hard on Petropavlovka. And we see also a close-up of Petropavlovka, which shows where the defensive positions that the Ukrainians have created, this place called Nietycha, is located. And all of this very close to Kupiansk itself. Kupiansk, literally just a few kilometers away, with the fighting now very much on its eastern outskirts. And Redovka then does add a word of caution. It says that with all the significant advance of the Russian army, it will not be easy to take Kupiansk. The Ukrainian authorities have quickly turned the city into one large fortified area with many strongholds in each residential building, as was the case in Bakhmut. A forced evacuation of the civilian population has been organized, and some civilians, including women, well, that's what the Russians say, according to a number of sources, have been forced to carry out engineering work to strengthen the prepared positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The assault on Kupiansk will not happen tomorrow or even in a week, but for the Russian army, this will be a new tactical success and an opportunity to fully show all its power. Now, I would say this. One of the things that became clear once the Wagner forces had broken into the center of Bakhmut is that the claims that the Ukrainians had been able to create extensive fortifications in the center of Bakhmut itself were greatly overstated. The Ukrainian positions within Bakhmut, in the center of Bakhmut, turned out to be relatively weak and easy for the Wagner forces to break through. The more difficult fighting was in the capture of the surrounding villages, some of which had indeed been fortified by the Ukrainians very extensively. But of course, the Ukrainians had months in which to prepare these fortifications. They have not had anything like the same amount of time to prepare comparable fortifications in Kupiansk, and it is unlikely that they have been able to do so. I'm also going to suspect that the Ukrainian forces which are going to try to defend Kupiansk do not include some of the elite formations that Ukraine sent to Bakhmut in order to try to defend that town. So whilst Radovka's words of warning are probably correct and appropriate, it might not be quite as much of a challenge for the Russian military to capture Kupiansk, a much smaller place, by the way, than Bakhmut, even though the area involved is about the same. But anyway, Kupiansk had a population, a pre-war population of about 25,000, as compared to 70,000 for Bakhmut. Just gives us some sense of the relative scales. But anyway, it might not be quite as complicated an operation for the Russians as Radovka is implying. There's a further factor to bear in mind from all of this. The news on the battlefronts is bad, but there are more reasons for further concern, at least from a Ukrainian point of view. Now, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has been again busy. He's been inspecting various military units. He's attended a convention on the military that takes place in Russia, usually around this time next year. Also involves war games, by the way. And over the course of it, he disclosed that there are around 40,000 troops, 40,000 men recruited from Moscow, serving in the Russian military in the zone of special military operations. And Strana, one of the best Ukrainian channels, in fact, in my opinion, perhaps the single best Ukrainian channel, though its reward for that is to be looked upon with very considerable skepticism by the Ukrainian authorities. But anyway, put that aside. Strana has made a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and it's pointed out that if one extrapolates from the number of recruits drawn from Moscow, which accounts for about 9% of the Russian population, if one assumes that Russia has recruited a similar proportion of men from the rest of the country, then Russian forces in the zone of the special military operation now number around 500,000. And it's also pointed out that there have been many rumors and reports that the Russian military has actually engaged in lighter recruitment in Moscow than in other places. And it is no doubt the case that in some of the small towns and villages of Russia, you're more likely perhaps, as you are in most countries, to find patriotically minded young men who are willing to enlist in the army in this kind of war. It's true of every country I know. It's certainly true of Britain. It's true of the United States, I believe, as well. You're less likely to find recruits for the British military in London, say, than you will in some of the small towns across England and Scotland and Wales. But anyway, put all that aside. If Russia is the same, which it may be, then it could be that the total number of Russian troops recruited in Moscow is proportionately lower than in the rest of Russia, in which case the total number of Russian troops in the conflict zone will be above 500,000. Now, I think this is probably true, but it's important to stress again that before the Russians can launch an offensive with all of these men, they will need first to train them, and that may take a while. And it does seem to be the case that the training systems are still in process, and Not all of the men who have volunteered to join the Russian army this year are probably up fully trained to do so. And it's also probably the case that the Russians will want to stockpile ammunition and build up equipment before they launch an offensive themselves. And there's again a lot of discussion about the situation with Russian ammunition stocks. Russia, by all accounts, is manufacturing a lot more shells than the United States and the West is. People have again brought this topic, and it's been suggested to me that I'm ignoring the contribution of the Europeans to Ukraine's war effort. But in fact, we have numbers on this. The United States apparently is producing around 24,000 shells a month, and the European Union is producing around 4,000 shells a month. This against a usage of shells by Ukraine, which is running at about 8,000 a day. Nowhere near enough shells being produced in the West to keep up with Ukrainian needs. We don't have figures for the amount of shells that the Russians are producing, but I've seen numbers range from 3 million to 6 million. It's been suggested again that together with stockpiles, that is enough to meet Russian current needs, but that the Russians would need to increase production further still and to stockpile more shells in order to conduct an intensive offensive in the future. Well, I've seen some numbers up to 24 to 26 million shells a year being spoken about as what Russia would need to conduct an offensive lasting as long as the one Ukraine has been conducting. That may seem an astonishingly high number of shells for Russia to produce. Perhaps it is. But of course, if Russia needs to stockpile shells, it will take time. Though I would say that apparently the Soviet Union during the Second World War produced 100 million shells. 100 million shells a year. Of course, that was in conditions of total war, which Russia is not in at the moment. But then, of course, the Russian economy is today much bigger and much more sophisticated than the Soviet Union's economy was during the Second World War. So just making these observations, these are just guesses. I'm not going to try and speculate. But one way or the other, I think it is likely that the Russians will stockpile shells, train more troops, equip further before they launch their offensive. And it could be that that offensive will take place in the spring. But when it does come, all the indications are that it will come as a hammer blow for Ukraine. And comments by Russian officials, including General Mordvichev, all seem to point in that direction. General Mordvichev is one of the Russian commanders of the forces that are pushing the Ukrainians back on the Oskol River line near Kupiansk. He spoke about the war being over next spring. So, given that this is so, where is the incentive for the Russians to negotiate? They're not losing the war. They're holding back Ukraine's offensive. They're defeating Ukraine's offensive. They're advancing in Kupiansk and the areas around it. And as I said already, the recapture of Kupiansk would be a major psychological blow for Ukraine, given that this was one of the places recaptured by Ukraine during the Kharkiv offensive last year, which was Ukraine's only major success so far in this war. So the Russians are not under military pressure. Their forces are building up. They have hundreds of thousands of men, either in the army, serving on the battlefronts, or training and re-equipping. They're probably producing shells, definitely at a greater rate than the US and the West are capable of. Where is the pressure on them going to come from? Well, diplomatic pressure, try and turn the global south against them. But why would the global south want to turn against them? Even that article in the Financial Times, the article by Zagramoso, concedes that that China, for example, which is the key country, is most unlikely to impose pressure on Russia to compromise. It says this is what Zagramoso says. Pressuring Russia to change its course in a war is a dangerous game for China. If Putin has to compromise and his grip on power weakens, China could lose a strategic partner. Furthermore, any settlement over Ukraine risks loosening Moscow's economic and diplomatic reliance on Beijing. Betting on a Chinese change of heart seems unwise. Well, I'm not sure I agree with all of the reasoning, but you see, even someone like Zagramoso concedes that the Chinese are most unlikely to put the kind of pressure on the Russians to change their mind. I doubt the rest of the global south will. And given that that is the case, again, where is the pressure on the Russians to compromise? Situation on the domestic economy? Well, there was that flurry of excitement over the depreciation of the ruble, a topic I have discussed at exhaustive length, and I'm not going to repeat what I've already said in previous videos. All I will say is that since Nabulina's action, since the central bank raised interest rates to 12% a few days ago, on Tuesday, since it started to strong-arm Russian exporters to buy rubles, the ruble has been strengthening its position against other currencies, against the dollar, the euro, and the Chinese RMB. I'm not, in fact, saying necessarily that this situation has been resolved. There might still be moments when the ruble comes under more pressure over the next few weeks. But as I have said, ultimately, the Russian central bank will bring this situation under control, and for the moment they appear to be doing so. The ruble briefly went above $100 to 100 rubles to the dollar. I believe it's now trading around 92 or 93. Perhaps not a vastly significant appreciation, but an appreciation nonetheless. And as I've already said, not only do I think the central bank will bring the situation with the ruble back under control, and the situation also with inflation also in Russia back under control, but by taking the strong approach that it took, it will before long buy itself room to start cutting interest rates again. So, unlikely to be much pressure on the Russians on the economic front either. In the run-up to Ukraine's offensive, the West passed up opportunities to begin negotiations because they were telling themselves that the offensive, Ukraine's offensive, would put Ukraine in a much stronger position to negotiate with the Russians from a position of strength. Why should the same calculation not apply to the Russians. They are working towards an offensive, perhaps in the spring, with far bigger prospects of success than the one Ukraine is currently undertaking. Why would they not, at the very least, wait until that offensive has taken place before considering negotiations? Surely, from their point of view, given that the prospects of their offensive seem pretty good, it makes more sense for the Russians to wait until their offensive succeeds, as they would expect, and their position becomes much stronger. Anyway, the key takeaway from all of this is that despite these continued expressions of support for Ukraine from Western leaders, it seems to me that there is now a hunt for a way out, as well as, I suspect, recriminations taking place about what has gone wrong. And one can see that, as I've discussed in previous programs, the Americans and the Ukrainians are blaming each other. The Americans because the Ukrainians aren't following proper tactics, and there's now insinuations that General Zaluzhny is not really up to the job. Last year, he was a general of the status of Napoleon or Caesar. Today, he is the incompetent who led the Ukrainians to defeat on the southern fronts. But there we are. That's the way things happen, I suppose, in war. As somebody once said, victory has many fathers, but defeat is an orphan. And if you're in a defeat situation, you want to put the blame on someone else, and it does look as if Zaluzhny is being set up for that role. But anyway, so we can see the recriminations taking place, the Ukrainians, for their part, complaining angrily that they've not received all the weapons that they needed. But recriminations underway, a hunt for a compromise. Hope, belief that the Russians will agree to a compromise when it is presented to them. Frustration that for the moment they're not showing any interest in such a compromise whatsoever. Dark hints that it's all Putin's fault, and insinuations that the way out is for the Kremlin oligarchs, these mythological oligarchs that supposedly control the Kremlin, to finally do what the West has been telling them to do since at least the time of the 2014 crisis, which is to get Putin out of the way. It all looks hopelessly desperate to me. It is not a real diplomatic strategy. It is again an exercise in denial of the realities, and a vast amount of effort and energy expended on something that in the end simply isn't going to work. Anyway, that's where we are with the situation in the conflict, the war in Ukraine up to this point. There are other things going on. Now, I said yesterday that with the African Union now coming out strongly against a military intervention in Niger, and with divisions within ECOWAS appearing to suggest that ECOWAS states are far from united behind an intervention, that the prospects of an intervention in Niger by ECOWAS have receded. Well, that was yesterday. A few hours later, we got reports that ECOWAS is now close to the point of putting together an intervention force. So it looks as if the intervention is back on again, after having been, switched off, ECOWAS, or at least some of the states within ECOWAS, are prepared to defy the African Union and launch an intervention after all. We will see what happens. There has, in the meantime, been a telephone conversation between the interim president of Mali and no less a person than President Putin. And this took place on the 15th of August, so 2 days ago. And we read a Russian readout which says the following. At the Malian side's initiative, President Putin had a telephone conversation with interim president of the Republic of Mali, Assimi Goïta. And the readout goes on to say, following up on the Russia-Mali top-level talks held in St. Petersburg on July 29th, these were the talks that took place in the context of the Russia-Africa summit. The presidents, that's to say, President Putin and interim president Assimi Goïta, discussed several aspects of developing friendly bilateral relations. The parties specifically focused on the current situation in the Sahara-Sahel region and emphasized in particular the importance of settling the situation in the Republic of Niger solely through peaceful political and diplomatic means. So Mali, getting nervous, it's strongly opposed to an intervention by ECOWAS in Niger. Its leader has called Putin. Putin agrees that the way forward is through a peaceful, political and diplomatic settlement. But there's no sign that he's taking any measures, any steps to prevent an intervention by ECOWAS. If that is what the leader of Mali was hoping for, well, there's nothing in this readout to suggest that he got it. In the meantime, there's more news about coming from Niger. Apparently, there was a clash between the Niger military and a jihadi group, presumably in the north of Niger. There's even some suggestions that it was ISIS that was involved, though I'm not going to say definitely that that was the case. But anyway, there's been a clash, and it seems as if some jihadi groups are now trying to take advantage of the unstable situation in Niger to try to improve their position in Niger. Of course, if there is an ECOWAS intervention, and if the Niger military collapses, which might do, then the position of these jihadi groups will become stronger still. It all looks to me very ill-conceived to launch this intervention, but as I've discussed in previous programs, and as Alex Christoforou and I have discussed on the Duran, it seems that for some people, Niger is too important to let go, and despite the risks, it looks as if, despite the opposition of the African Union and many of the big regional states, some kind of intervention might be on the cards after all. Well, if so, I will cover it fully in future programs, but this is where this program ends today. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. To repeat, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also support our work by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all our hoodies, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.